Picture a girl of 14, already promised in marriage, already expected within a year or two to be managing a household, bearing children, and taking on the full weight of adult responsibility in a community that considered this completely, unremarkably normal. Not a shocking exception, not a crisis, just how things worked for the overwhelming majority of recorded human history, across civilizations that had no contact with each other, no shared religious tradition forcing the practice onto them, arriving independently at strikingly similar answers to a question that feels, to modern eyes, genuinely uncomfortable to sit with directly. This isn't a fringe historical footnote. Marriage at ages that would be considered alarmingly young by modern Western legal and social standards was, by an enormous body of historical and anthropological evidence, close to the global default for most of recorded human history, across an extraordinary range of independent civilizations, from ancient Rome to medieval Europe to numerous societies across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. So the honest question worth spending real time on isn't whether this happened. The historical record on that is not seriously in dispute. It's why. What set of pressures, biological, economic, and social, converged again and again across cultures with no contact with each other to produce such a consistently early marriage age, and what actually changed to make the modern expectation of considerably later marriage feel, today, like the obvious, natural, correct standard instead. Let's start with the biological piece, because it's the most fundamental, and it connects directly back to something we've discussed at length on this channel already, the paternity uncertainty problem and the broader evolutionary pressures shaping human pair bonding. For the overwhelming majority of human history, before reliable birth control, before modern medicine dramatically reduced maternal and infant mortality, before formal education systems extended childhood and adolescence into a considerably longer social category than it had ever been treated as before, a woman's reproductive window was the single most biologically and economically significant fact about her adult life, from the perspective of a family and a community organized around survival, inheritance, and continuity. Marriage shortly after the onset of puberty, uncomfortable as it is to say plainly, maximized the number of childbearing years available to a woman within a system where child mortality was extraordinarily high, and where a family's economic and social survival often depended directly on the number of surviving children a marriage produced. Historical demographic research studying pre-industrial populations across multiple regions has estimated that child mortality rates before the age of 5 frequently exceeded 30 to 50% in many historical populations, a genuinely staggering figure by modern standards, meaning families needed to produce considerably more children than they expected to survive to adulthood, simply to maintain stable population levels and ensure enough surviving offspring to support aging parents and continue a family's line at all. This connects directly to something demographers and historians call the demographic imperative, essentially the raw mathematical reality that in a world with high infant and child mortality, low life expectancy, and no reliable birth control, beginning childbearing as early as biologically possible wasn't viewed as exploitative in the way it's rightly understood today, but as a practical, often urgent necessity for family and community survival. Historian and demographer researchers studying pre-modern European populations specifically, including extensive parish record analysis conducted by scholars working in the tradition established by demographic historian Peter Laslett, have found that average marriage ages actually varied considerably more across history and geography than popular imagination often assumes. With Western European marriage patterns in particular, especially from the late medieval period onward, showing somewhat later average marriage ages than many other historical regions and time periods. A detail worth holding on to because it complicates the idea that extremely young marriage was a single, universal constant across all of human history rather than a pattern with genuine regional and temporal variation. Now let's talk about the economic piece, because this is where the picture gets considerably more specific and, in some ways, more uncomfortable, because it connects marriage age directly to property, inheritance, and formal economic transaction in ways that echo exactly the patterns we've already covered regarding virginity and paternity concerns on this channel. Across an enormous range of historical agricultural and early urban societies, Marriage functioned as considerably more than a personal or romantic decision between two individuals. It operated as a formal economic transaction between families, frequently involving the transfer of property, dowries, bride prices, and the formation of strategic alliances between family lineages, sometimes involving considerable wealth or political stakes. Under this framework, a daughter's marriage represented a genuinely significant economic and social event for her family, and delaying that marriage carried real, tangible costs, continued financial support for an unmarried daughter, a shrinking pool of favorable marriage prospects as she aged within a system that, as we've already discussed regarding the virginity concept, placed intense value specifically on youth and presumed premarital chastity, and lost opportunities to secure whatever economic or political alliance an earlier marriage might have made possible. Ancient Roman law, which we've referenced before on this channel in the context of adultery legislation, formally permitted marriage for girls beginning at age 12, a detail modern audiences frequently find genuinely shocking, though it's worth noting that actual average marriage ages among ordinary Roman citizens, based on surviving demographic and epigraphic evidence, appear to have often been somewhat later than the strict legal minimum, particularly among lower and middle economic classes where the specific economic and political incentives driving elite marriage strategies applied with considerably less force. This distinction matters genuinely, because a meaningful amount of the most extreme historical examples of very young marriage that get cited in popular discussion specifically involve elite and aristocratic families, precisely the families with the most significant property, political alliances, and inheritance stakes riding on marriage timing. While marriage patterns among ordinary agricultural and laboring populations across the same historical societies frequently show somewhat later, more economically pragmatic marriage ages, often tied directly to when a young couple could realistically establish an independent household with sufficient resources to support it. This detail connects to a genuinely important broader pattern historians and demographers have identified, sometimes called the European marriage pattern specifically, referring to a documented tendency in late medieval and early modern Western Europe for ordinary couples to delay marriage until they had accumulated sufficient independent economic resources, land, savings, and established trade, to support a new household, a pattern that pushed average marriage ages for ordinary people in these specific regions and periods considerably later than the earliest legal minimums or elite aristocratic marriage patterns might suggest, sometimes into the mid-20s for both partners. This is a genuinely important corrective to an oversimplified popular narrative, because it demonstrates that ancient and traditional societies married everyone off as children is a real pattern in some specific circumstances, particularly among elites and in certain historical and regional contexts, but not a single universal constant applying uniformly across every documented human society and every economic class within it. Let's bring this back to the biological piece one more time, because there's a genuinely important nuance worth addressing directly regarding puberty timing itself, since it connects to why this entire question feels so uncomfortable to modern audiences in the first place. Research on historical puberty onset ages, drawing on medical records, military conscription height and development data, and other historical demographic sources, has found fairly consistent evidence that the average age of puberty onset, menarche specifically for girls, has decreased meaningfully over roughly the past century and a half, likely driven by dramatic improvements in childhood nutrition and overall health across that period. Historical estimates place average menarche age in many pre-industrial populations somewhere in the range of 15 to 16 years old on average, compared to considerably younger average ages, often around 12 to 13, documented in many modern populations with substantially improved childhood nutrition. This is a genuinely important piece of context, because it means the biological milestone historically associated with marriageability in many traditional societies was, on average, occurring somewhat later than modern audiences sometimes assume when picturing historical marriage practices, even though the overall marriage ages involved remain, by any modern standard, considerably younger than what contemporary society considers appropriate or ethical. So what actually changed? Because the modern expectation of marriage considerably later, often well into a person's 20s or beyond, is itself a historically recent development worth explaining directly rather than simply treating as the timeless, obvious human default. Several converging historical forces drove this shift, and they align closely with broader patterns of economic and social transformation. The dramatic decline in child and infant mortality rates, driven by improvements in medicine, sanitation, and nutrition particularly from the 19th century onward, removed much of the demographic urgency that had previously made early childbearing a practical necessity for family and community survival. The expansion of formal education, extending well into adolescence and increasingly into early adulthood, created an entirely new social category, extended adolescence and young adulthood, that simply didn't exist in the same form across most of human history, where the transition from childhood directly to adult responsibility, including marriage and childbearing, happened considerably more quickly and directly. And the emergence of reliable birth control technology in the 20th century fundamentally decoupled marriage and sexual activity from immediate, inevitable childbearing for the first time in human history, removing much of the practical urgency that had previously connected marriage timing so tightly to a woman's biological reproductive window. Here's the honest, layered conclusion worth sitting with as we close this out, because it resists a simple, comfortable, single explanation. Early marriage across human history wasn't driven by a single cause: moral failure, ignorance, or casual disregard for children's well-being by modern standards, though modern moral judgment of specific historical practices, particularly among elite families using children as instruments of political and economic strategy, remains entirely legitimate and important to maintain. It emerged from a genuine convergence of demographic necessity in a world of brutally high child mortality, economic and inheritance systems that treated marriage as a formal transaction between families rather than purely a personal choice between individuals, and a biological reality where puberty, however later on average than commonly assumed, still arrived considerably earlier in a person's life relative to the total lifespan and social expectations of the time than it does in the radically different demographic and economic world modern society now inhabits. The specific age we now consider appropriate for marriage isn't some universal, timeless human truth suddenly discovered by modern society. It's the direct, traceable product of dramatically reduced child mortality, an entirely new extended social category of adolescence that previous eras simply didn't have the luxury or infrastructure to support, and reliable birth control finally severing the tight, urgent link between marriage timing and biological reproductive necessity that had shaped human marriage patterns for nearly the entirety of our species' recorded existence.